Hi. So in this video, I'd like to talk briefly about why I believe that politics might be an illusion and the state as such is an illusion. Now, this stems from Carl Jung and his knowledge, his insight, from the book called The Undiscovered Self. If you'd like to check it for yourself, then link is in the description. Now, why do I believe that politics is an illusion? I could give you a simple example. The state, as such, has no morality, no identity, and no honor, if you think about it. If it did have an identity, then it would be an individual, which it is not. Another paradox is that the state was created to help the individual, but ultimately it ends up suppressing the individual. Now, does that mean that we should get rid of the state? No. No. That's not at all the message that I'm trying to leave. My example would be from 1938 at the Munich conference, where Czechoslovakia was about to be annexed by Nazi Germany, and France and UK were threatening Nazi Germany and Hitler at the time, the German dictator, that if he annexes Czechoslovakia, it's going to be an act of war, and they're going to declare war on Germany, which eventually did not happen until later, as we know. From this, you can realize that France and the UK did not stand up to their promises. And the same thing is happening right now with Ukraine, the US, where the US holds negotiations, but Ukraine is not at the table. This shows you that states as such have no morality, no identity, and no honor. And the reason being is because they only look out for themselves. That is the reality that you need to accept. So, if we believe in this illusion, we believe that states are moral entities, which they are not. We believe that they stand for something, whereas in reality, they only serve their individual, which, paradoxically, they also end up suppressing, right? If politics and the state as such is an illusion, then there must be an illusion of political power. People such as politicians, they might seem powerful, but in truth they are prisoners of their own illusion that they live within. They operate essentially like a machine. Once they are inside the state, they hold the power. Even the most idealistic politicians can become part of the state. They can become part of this machine. They can compromise their own values. So you might think that in democracies, these leaders, these representatives, they are supposed to be moral. And yes, sometimes that is the case, but that is in reality very, very rare. There's also a paradox of power. The more power one seeks, the less freedom they have, right? So these individuals, they become confined within their own little world. Geopolitics as such is actually an artificial reality, right? A chessboard, where nations pretend to act rationally, yet history is full of irrational and fear-driven, right? Emotionally driven, psychologically driven decisions that shape our world. So if you were to just zoom out and look at Earth from the space, you'd think to yourself, that's crazy, that's an anarchy, right? That's happening on Earth. There are these states that are fighting each other, doing whatever they want just to look out for their own sake. And you think that people are crazy for doing that. Another thing is dictators, right? If we talk about power, we need to mention dictators who use the facade of the state to hide behind it. So if you were to take an example like Vladimir Putin, he's using the excuse to invade another country. He's using the excuse that he's doing it in Russia's interest, right? So he's hiding behind the state. And dictators essentially exploit the unconscious fears of the masses, right? Projecting an image of stability and control while using the machinery of the state for their personal will. Jung warned about this, and he said that the more unconscious a population is, it is easier to be to manipulate the population as such, right? So there's essentially a paradox of the state. The greatest irony is that the state was created to serve the individual, but over time, it becomes an entity that suppresses him and his own individuality. It doesn't even have to mean suppressing him as in jailing him. It could just be that society enacts these, it demands these norms, this behavior from you, and it ultimately suppresses who you really are, right? And that's good to an extent. Now, this conformity that it demands out of you can breed masses, right? This mass-mindedness is very, very threatening to the individual. You could see it in the MAGA movement in America, and in the opposite movement that's actually anti-Trump. These are all just mass movements driven by emotions, driven by fear. They do not respect the individual. That's the biggest threat of these movements. And the more power this collective mass-mindedness has, the less freedom the individual retains, right? So the greatest danger is not external enemies, like for instance the MAGA movement would have you believe that that's actually the immigrants. No, it is the unconscious surrender of individual responsibility to the state. The real problem is that people refuse to look within, and instead they externalize all their problems. And you might ask yourself, what's the solution to this? Well, it would be an awakening. Jung's answer is not political, but psychological, because that's where all these issues stem from. They are inherently psychological. The real revolution is not in the streets, but it's in the mind of the individual. Now, this creates a big problem because you might think to yourself, if it's within the individual, then why is there no change? And that's because not everyone does this. The real war that we are supposed to wage is within ourselves, within our own minds, right? We are the greatest threat to ourselves and humanity as such. Because essentially, Jung's message is that the world hangs on a very thin thread, and that is the psyche of the individual. People who remain unconscious will always fall into political illusions, believing that salvation comes from systems, leaders, or ideologies, right? But awakening means recognizing that you are responsible for your own psyche, what's going on here and here in your heart. No system can save you from yourself. Mass mindedness leads to slavery, but self awareness leads to true freedom. You can spot a lot of paradoxes in these regimes. Like, for instance, the communist regime of the Soviet Union, it comes from the word commune, right? Community, people. But its name was supposed to represent what it stands for, right? The community. But it essentially ended up suppressing the community, right? Now, there's a lot to this, more than just this. There's an inherent problem regarding the Western man's religiosity. Religion stands for an individual's relationship with something greater than himself, a god, some may call it, a higher force that your life is responsible to. And there is a lack of that in today's world. And that comes from an emphasis on rationality in today's world. People look at the world from a rational point of view. They prioritize scientific perspective over the irrational perspective, which is also valuable because the pendulum of the mind does not oscillate between right or wrong, it oscillates between sanity and insanity, right? And you have to find a balance.